Hello everyone. In today's video, my colleague and I will be showing you how to replace the main shaft on a Spider 1330 gearbox. We'll start the disassembly process by removing the gear shaft as seen here. Just remember to use the correct tools when disassembling the gearbox. We'll go ahead and install the shift star locking tool now. You can break the torque. We've already done so off camera. And once the bolts remove, we can go ahead and remove the shift star from the gearbox. We'll continue the disassembly by removing the gearbox position sensor. Once the two bolts are removed, you can gently pull it away from the gearbox casing. And for reference only, we go ahead and remove the support cover at this time, removing the two bolts, and then you can use a flathead screwdriver to pry it apart. Please pay attention to the note that was presented in the video as well. So with all those components removed, we can go ahead and rotate the case. And here we'll be able to see the circlip on the main shaft. We'll go ahead and use a recommended circlip tool to go ahead and remove this at this point. So from here, we can go ahead with splitting the case in half. Pay attention as there are points where you can use a flathead screwdriver to pry the case in. So there should be one on either side as shown in the video. And here's the second one. And there's another on that side of the casing. Continuing on with the disassembly, we've gone ahead and lifted the gearbox off the bench with a couple of 2x4 blocks. Use the flathead screwdriver at those points referenced before to create some space between the case, and then use a rubber mallet to tap on the main shaft while you're pulling up on the casing. Repeat this step a couple of times, and you should then have the top half separate from the bottom as seen here. Here you can see we have the repair kit laid out, part number 219800615, which includes all the gaskets, O-rings, and circlips needed to perform the repair, along with the HCM cover and a new main shaft. Continue along with the disassembly. We can start removing the components. We can start by removing the shift fork pins from both sides. It would be very important to pay attention to the stacking order of the gears and components, as this will be critical when reassembling the gearbox. With the shafts removed, we continue by removing the shaft fingers from the drum, then removing the drum assembly along with the bearing. And then we can remove the drum shaft as well. Then we'll start with the two top forks off the main shaft and cut shaft assemblies. And then remove the top gear. This is also a good time to make sure that you're stacking the order correctly. We'll go ahead and remove a needle bearing as seen here using a small pry tool. In this section, we'll be disassembling the clutch shaft assembly. We'll start by removing the top gear, followed by the second gear. And below that, you'll find a needle bearing, which you'll use a small flathead screwdriver to pry some space in between the bearing, and then gently slide up off of the shaft. From here, we can continue with disassembling the clutch shaft assembly. Pay attention to the order in which the gears are coming off, as this will be important when reassembling the gearbox. From here, we will do the same thing on the main shaft. You'll have a gear, followed by a washer and a needle bearing. And then below that will be the circlip. Continuing along, we'll be removing the circlip off of the main shaft. Just make sure you're using the appropriate tool. You can possibly use something from Snap or another generic brand, just making sure that it does the job well. With the circlip out of the groove, you can use your fingers to help slide it off of the main shaft. Then go ahead and remove the next gear. And below the gear, you'll have another needle bearing that you use a flathead to pry a little bit of space and then slide it up off of the shaft. Here we'll go ahead and remove the main shaft from the casing. You may have to tap from the bottom end up and then wiggle just to get it out. And there's one gear remaining that we'll need to remove for the disassembly. Now we're just going to pay attention to the stacking order on the bottom half of the main shaft. So first we have washer, gear, needle bearing, another washer, and then shift dog. And then from here, there's going to be a circlip on the inside that needs to be removed for the last gear. Okay. Move the circlip. Gear, and we have one more needle bearing. And that's it. We have our old shaft, which we're going to be replacing with a new shaft that comes with the kit. Here we have the main shaft and clutch shaft layouts. Starting from your left, you have first gear on the far left, then fourth gear, second gear, and reverse on the main shaft. And on your right, you have the clutch shaft with fifth gear, third gear, and sixth gear for reference. When preparing the case halves for reassembly, you can use a silicone brush as seen here to clean the excess gasket off of the case halves, or you can use a steel brush, brushing in one direction and then doing in the alternate direction to make sure that all debris is removed from the case halves. Okay, now that we've got the entire assembly disassembled, this is a good time to take a look and make sure that all our bearings are in good order. So I would start on this half of the case, make sure that they're spinning free, there's no debris. Same, and your idler bearing here as well. Also pay attention to the outside half of the case. So we did apply some heat in some instances to break the thread lock. So make sure you pay special attention to this bearing, that it's moving freely, there's no damage to the rubber casings of the bearing. Same on this idler, and inspect your reverse idler gear as well, just to make sure it's in good order and all our bolts and hardware are tightened on the inside. And then we can continue with the reassembly from here. Continuing along with the reassembly, we'll set aside the outer half of the gear case, as we found it easier to reassemble using this half once we have the shafts reassembled. Now we'll continue reassembling the clutch shaft assembly. Pay attention to the stacking order and the position of the gears, making sure that everything is in the correct order. Be careful when reinserting the needle bearings that they're not stretched too far to cause any damage. and watch the direction in which the shift dogs are being installed. Pay special attention to the top gear, showing that that extra protrusion will go downwards, mating with the gear as shown. Here we'll repeat the same reassembly steps for the main shaft, paying attention not to stretch the needle bearings while reinserting them onto the shaft, and also pay attention to the order or the direction in which the gears are being put on to make sure that the shift dogs do mate correctly. When installing the circlip, just make sure not to overstretch to cause any damage, and make sure that it's seated correctly in the groove. Just double check once it's seated to make sure that is a proper fitment. Here we're highlighting again just to make sure that the shift dogs are aligning with the gears to make sure that they are able to mate, as this can cause an issue if it's installed incorrectly. And with a little bit of alignment, we can get it to drop into place. We can install another washer and then another needle bearing, followed by a gear, and it's meshing with the teeth of the shift dog here again as shown. First tip, we began by using the outer half of the gearbox assembly as seen here to install the main shaft. Install the shift fork, as it's easier to do it at this point in time. Then, as you'll see in a couple seconds, we'll need to remove the two top gears off of the main shaft assembly, as it will cause some interference when installing the clutch shaft. Tip number 2, we went ahead and removed the two lower gears off of the clutch shaft assembly, install them inside of the case, meshing with the idler gear at the bottom, and placing your finger through the bearing to align the gears. Proceed with installing the clutch shaft into the assembly. With the shaft seated, you go ahead and install the remaining shift forks into the assembly. Reattach the removed gears from the assembly as well. In this section, we lifted the gearbox to get some clearance for the shafts. At this point in time, you can apply a little bit more force to the shaft assembly and it should fall into place. Once it does, proceed with installing the remaining shift forks into the gearbox. Once both shafts are installed, we'll go ahead and install the shift drum. So just make sure to pay attention to the bearing, make sure it's sitting flush in the case. Slide this in, then you can use a long screwdriver or pry tool to gently move the shift forks out of the way so that you can get the drum completely seated into the case. Now we can take a 90-degree pick and just gently lift the shift forks into the drum grooves, paying attention to make sure that they're seated correctly, both the top and the bottom forks on the main and clutch shafts. Once the forks are installed, we can proceed with installing the shift fork pins. Make sure they're seated all the way in the casing into their recessed holes. Okay, with all components installed, we can go ahead and mate the second half of the casing to the gearbox. Just pay attention to the alignment when reinstalling, and the guide pins at the side of the casings should align both halves together. Just apply a little bit of force and both halves should go together easily. Once assembled, we flip the gearbox on its side, just tapping the shaft just a little to make sure that there was enough protrusion to install the circlip. Okay, just a point of reference, make sure when we're doing a reassembly that this hole is not blocked. This supplies oil to your alternator shaft. And looking on the engine side, just pay very close attention to the amount of sealant that's applied, that we do not block this hole.